Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about lessons from old games. I've never talked about this. Comes from a good question from Ewan Hasty 6779, and I hope I pronounced your name right, who asks, "Hi Tim, a question that hopefully hasn't been asked already. What do you think can be learned from old games? Is there any lost wisdom out there?" Yes, there is. Good question. Particularly good question because it's clear and short and to the point. So I really like that question. I'm not going to say I thought I had talked about this, but I do have a lot of other lessons from videos. I'll link them all below. It ranges from lessons from school, lessons from by company, lessons from failures, which I think is a particularly good one because I've learned the most from my games that didn't work out. But this is a good question about what can we learn from older games that were released. And in particular, I'm going to narrow this down and talk about lessons that you can learn from 80s games. That's games from the 1980s. Because A, I was there, I was present. It was my teen years, but I had a game industry job. I was making games for set-top console boxes. I was making PC games. So I know what I'm talking about, and I can speak from experience, not from, oh, I heard, but this is what happened. This is what we did. And let me just sum up for you what the 80s were like. Our hardware was not powerful. It was, my smartphone is more powerful than any computer I worked on in the 80s in terms of speed, in terms of memory, just in every possible way. There were no hardware standards, and you guys really have to understand what this means. Games were being made for PC, for Apple, for Atari, for Commodore, for all a wild assortment of consoles. Atari, Nintendo, and television, Odyssey. There was nothing standardized across any of those. In fact, if you made any game for a stand-up arcade game, it was often on unique hardware made just for that machine. There were no software standards. Sometimes we worked in C. Sometimes we worked in BASIC. Sometimes we worked directly in assembly because that's the only way you could get the speed. There were no design standards. There were no pillars. There were no documents about pacing and economy. None of this stuff. In fact, there wasn't even specialization in the industry. You basically had programmers and sometimes artists, but sometimes the programmers did the art. And that's it. You didn't have narrative designers. You didn't have rigging specialists. You certainly didn't have anybody who specialized so narrowly that they didn't do most of the other tasks that were on the game. So these games were really focused because they had to be. And what I want to talk about today, the lessons you can learn from that is you can learn a lot from games that were required to be focused, because I think that's kind of an overriding possible issue with today's games is they don't really know what they want to be. They try to be everything to everyone, designed by committee, making a publisher happy, trying to guess what the largest demographic wants. So let's talk about 80s games and what we can learn. And I'm going to start with something I've already mentioned, which was hyper-efficient code. You didn't have a lot of memory. You didn't have fast processors. You needed to be efficient. It's not that you wanted to be efficient, or wouldn't it be cool if we were efficient? It was you write efficient code or your game doesn't work. On the Atari console, just doing graphics required timing. You didn't say, I want a pixel drawn here. You measured how many milliseconds it was, and then you said, turn on. And it would turn on and turn off, and then you had a pixel at that spot in the screen. That was remarkably tightly controlled. You have no idea. And it wasn't like you could go look it up anywhere. There were no documents for any of these things. You just had to figure it out or learn from someone who knew or wade your way through really technical hardware specs to try to figure out what to do. What memory locations needed to have values written to them to change the hardware into a different video mode or to get the location of a mouse cursor or if a key was pressed. Super efficient. Second thing I want to talk about is tight game loops. I have a video on core game loops, so I don't want to repeat all that here, but I define the core game loop as what most players spend most of their time doing. That's the core game loop. In 80s games, that game loop was tight. It was, here's the gameplay, doing it, you're doing it now, you're immediately dropped in, you're doing it, have fun. And these game loops were small and tight because they had to be. We couldn't make giant sprawling games with tons of different things. Like, I think I'll go craft now. I think I'll go explore now. I go think I'll do this puzzle now. I go think I'll do combat now. I go think I'll talk to all these NPCs now. You couldn't do all that. You had to pick what section, what segment of all that gameplay do I want to represent? And then you did that. There was no, the idea that you could have a core game loop that was a huge variety of actions just pretty much did not exist. Which brings me to the next thing about 80s games is you were always playing. You can think of that as the ABP of games. Always be playing. You didn't spend your time in front of this console or this arcade stand-up or your computer watching the game show you things. If it did, it was super brief. It was like a villain would pop, ha, 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 I have the ring now, ha, ha, ha. And then you're like right in there and you're shooting, all of his minions and stuff, and I'm going to get you, villain. You were always playing. There were no 5-minute cutscenes. There were no in-game camera changing. There was no long conversations because there couldn't be. That was unsupported. So you were always playing those games. You would always be playing. Brings me to the next thing, which was 80s games had very, very focused stories. You could describe the story probably in a sentence or two because, of course, they had to be short. Usually the goals were really simple. Find this ancient artifact. Rescue someone. Kill a villain. Maybe 2 of those. Rarely 3 of those. Not much more than that. And if the game was wrapped around a villain, it was usually, okay, I'm going to go get this villain. So first I'm going to kill a lot of henchmen or a lot of, trash mobs. And then they get harder and I may encounter his lieutenant. And then finally I'm up against the villain and it's what the whole game has built towards. And that's it. That's it. You might even play a game where it doesn't even have that. It doesn't even have a story. It's just go into this dungeon and collect treasure. That's the entirety of Gauntlet. You're playing to get stuff, and that's it. Or sometimes you're just playing to live. That's the entirety of Berserk and Antic, the sequel to Berserk. You're just playing to live. How far can you live? Like Pac-Man. How long can you go on a quarter? That's the entirety of the story. Which brings me to the related thing, which is settings. All these games have very simple settings that can be described like, remember when movie trailers used to always start, in a world? You could do that for 80s games, and you would say one sentence, and that would be the entire setting. Aliens have invaded. Necromancer is running amok and killing people, and then bringing them back as zombies. Or the robots have rebelled. You need to stop it. And that's it. That's the story. Now, there could be some complexity for the player to look for. There might be books for them to read, pop-ups that they can, they click on something and a pop-up happens. But you didn't have to do it, and there weren't nearly as many of those as there are in today's games because you just didn't have the memory to store all that. And yeah, I'm talking text. We didn't have the memory to store all that text. We didn't have much memory. I always like to point to the Lord of the Rings at this point because I love Lord of the Rings. You can view the setting of the Lord of the Rings as, here's here's a fantasy world. And then the storyline is basically the bad guy lost an artifact. If he gets it, this whole world is destroyed. So let's go destroy it ourselves. That's it. That's the entire thing. There's a lot of complexity that you can dive down into if you want, but you don't need it. And since earlier games couldn't provide it, they just gave you that bare bones setting. Hey, you live in a fantasy world. Hey, there's a bad guy. Go destroy his ring. Ba-doom. Okay, so what does all this mean? What lessons can you learn from all this? Old games couldn't do very much, so they avoided a problem of modern games that I see as becoming indulgent. They add too many things thinking those more of those things make the game better, when really what they do is they dilute the game. I frequently, because I'm always talking about food, I'm thinking about food, talking about food, eating food. Think of a fancy restaurant. If you've ever been to really high-end restaurants, sometimes the most delicious dinners you've ever had have a very small set of ingredients. It's, here's this sea bass, and here's a little bit of salt, and maybe 1 or 2 seasonings, and some butter. And what's amazing about it is how it was prepared, and that the ingredients are the absolute freshest, best, nicest things you could possibly get. You wouldn't even know where to buy some, a fish or a cut of steak of this quality, and you might not be able to. Some of the really high cuts of beef are sold to restaurants first, and you're lucky to be able to find them. You'd have to go to a butcher to find them. You're not going to find them in your grocery store. What I'm saying here, there weren't a lot of extras, so it had to be done right. So those early games were kind of like fancy restaurants. You kind of had to do it right, or you really couldn't do it. And I'm not saying there weren't a lot of bad games. By bad games, I mean not good for you. But when you play a lot of games back then, you encountered your bad ones, the ones that ran slow or crashed or just didn't work right or you didn't like. But most games back then, the barrier to entry was so high, but by the time you made a game, it at least was efficient and tight, because it had to be. And the question now is, can you do this today? You can. The problem is you don't have to. So I see it a lot in indie games more often, because indie games, since it's usually done by one person or a very small team, they don't have a lot of people to do a lot of things. So they focus on a very tight core game loop. You can do this too. But the difficulty is when you start making a game, it's easy to go, I want to add this and I like this and I just played a game that had this, so I want to pull it in. You need to be simple. You need to stay focused. And whatever you do has to be extremely well executed. And then you'll be like that fancy restaurant. You don't got a lot of ingredients in that meal, but that meal was delicious. And I will throw out, I know discoverability is an issue. I got a whole video about it. I'll link it below. But everybody faces that. The big pubs face it. The small indies face it. The big pubs deal with it by having a big marketing budget. The indies can try to overcome it by, if you're small, simple, easy to describe, and super good at what you do, it's like a friend always says, cream rises to the top. Good luck. And also, you and Hasty 6779, good question.